On a cold Houston night, a lonely widow opened her door to a woman who smelled like rain and thyme, and nothing would ever be the same. What began as a small, private act of mercy spread through a neighborhood like a candle flame until it became a story everyone whispered about. If you like stories that touch the heart and raise quiet questions, please like this video and subscribe. It helps these stories find the people who need them. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next part. There's more to come, and you'll want to hear how the whole neighborhood changed. Thank you for being here. Your support keeps these true feeling tales alive. On the night it started, the wind off Buffalo Bayou drove cold through the oaks on Montrose Court, the streetlights pooled in halos over cracked sidewalks, the neighborhood felt older than the city around it, a pocket of houses with sagging porches and iron-wrought fences where neighbors still waved when they passed. Houston is a city of heat and loud skylines, but this little corridor, 2 blocks of bungalows, a Spanish mission church, a shuttered feed store turned taco truck, had the quiet intimacy of a small town. People knew who had the last batch of peach jam, which houses lit their Christmas lights the longest, which porch steps were safe for a crying child. Margaret Ellis lived in a shotgun bungalow at the corner of Montrose and 3rd. She was 68, a widow for 5 years, a retired school secretary who had kept other people's papers in order while her own life slowly narrowed. Her husband, Tom, had loved to garden. She kept his roses and his rusted watering can because the sight of them made the house tolerable. Her steady, ordered days were now measured in the rituals of loss. The same mug in the morning, the same stack of crossword puzzles, the same small radio on at low volume that played shows from a different decade. Her neighbors checked in on her on Sundays, mostly with casseroles and gossip. She belonged to a small circle at St. Cecilia's, the Spanish mission-style church down the block, and to the house cat, Blue, who slept on her favorite chair. That night, a front moved through the city, the humidity broke. The air felt crisp as it had when Margaret and Tom first married in 1978. A storm was promised by the forecast man on television, and people thought of blankets and slow cooking. Margaret had finished her dinner early and had sat near the window with a quilt across her legs. She kept her porch light on out of habit. It seemed wrong to let the rectangle of home go dark. The knock at the door came just after 10. It was a quick, polite rap, not at all the forceful pounding of a stranger. Margaret saw a silhouette framed by the yellow porch light. She opened the door a crack and saw a woman with a thin shawl, water on her hair, and eyes that, for a moment, were too deep to place. "Evening," the woman said. Her voice was soft but steady, with an accent neither here nor there, a slow, rolling sigh of consonants that made Margaret listen twice. "I'm sorry to bother you, my things were stolen and I have no place to go tonight. May I come in a moment? Just to dry off?" Margaret's instinct was a practical one: call the sheriff, close the door, but the woman's face had something that pulled at the careful margins of her life. There was a fatigue in her shoulders that looked like hunger and a dignity that suggested she had been used to being treated with respect. Margaret thought of the women in the church who folded blankets for those who slept on the bus benches. She thought of Tom and his old rule: never leave a soul at your door in a storm. She felt suddenly like she was back at a crossroads Margaret once learned to trust. She opened the door wider and stepped aside. The woman came in like a guest who had every right to be there. Margaret's house smelled of lemon oil and lavender sachets. The stranger smelled like rain and the faint wool of older churches. She sat, settled the shawl over her knees, and warmed her hands over the cup of tea Margaret offered without thinking. They talked in small, practical sentences at first: where she'd been, where she'd come from. The woman said she had been walking and lost her small bag on the bus. She insisted on giving Margaret a name, and when Margaret asked, the woman's lips curved only slightly. "Call me Maria," she said, "just Maria." The next morning, Margaret woke to find the teacup still half warm and the lamp left on. Maria had been at the sink, washing dishes. Her hands were steady and quick, as if she had always known the right pressure to use. She did not talk about the night. She moved with the precise economy of someone who had lived in other people's rooms and learned how to leave them better. Small, tender things began to go right in Margaret's house. Blue, the cat, who normally tolerated strangers with narrowed eyes, made a nest on Maria's lap and slept like a dog. The roses at the back porch, which had browned at the edges all winter, opened a single surprised bud at noon. Margaret woke one morning to find the quilt, the one Tom had made, straightened and smoothed across the bed as if by invisible hands. Little repairs got done around the house. A leaky faucet stopped dripping. The front steps' warped board fit neatly as if hammered in place overnight. Neighbors noticed too. Mrs. Alvarez from across the street dropped by with tamales and mentioned in passing that Margaret's porch light had been on later than usual. The man who ran the taco truck said he'd seen Margaret's porch lamp glow at strange hours, a sign, he joked nervously, of someone reading late at night. People are quick to notice when the rhythm of a house changes. Quieter homes are easier to hear. At St. Cecilia's, parishioners murmured over the coffee pot about the new woman who had appeared at Margaret's door. Father James, a broad-shouldered man with a soft laugh and an eye for detail, went to visit. he sat at Margaret's kitchen table and asked the right questions. Maria's answers remained spare and humble. She spoke of prayer without sermonizing, of a childhood in a town whose name she never said. She refused offers of money. "I am not looking for riches," she said, "only warmth." Word moved through the neighborhood in the way word always moves in small corners of big cities. A neighbor tells a neighbor over a fence, a child repeats what they overheard in a schoolyard, a grocery clerk asks a regular and adds the detail of their own. The story took on small variations at the edges. Some said Maria could make a stew from almost nothing. Others swore they saw a light in Margaret's window that seemed to bend around the room like a visiting star. Not every reaction was gentle. A few people offered tentative suspicion, the kind that sits close to fear. A man in a truck stopped to ask questions and left with a mutter about strangers and safety. In a city where shelter is sometimes a profit calculation and empathy a courtesy, Maria's arrival was a live wire. The local paper ran a column about the mystery guest. In print, the columnist called Maria a transient. The label hurt the ears of some who had come to meet her friend. Then the trouble started. The desecration was small but detailed, a kind of willful thoughtlessness that stung because it had been deliberate. One Sunday afternoon, the statue of the Virgin that stood in a small niche at the back of St. Cecilia's was discovered knocked from its shelf. It had not been broken to pieces. The head had been scuffed and the blue cloak smudged with mud, but the figure lay face down on the tile as if pushed by hands that wanted to see what would happen. The community felt the shove through the church like a physical bump. People gathered in quietly furious groups over the next week. Who would do such a thing? Was it vandalism by bored teenagers? A targeted attack? The police questioned everyone they could think of. No one saw anything. The statue's base was scraped, as if someone had intentionally bored it out to make a point. Father James said nothing in the pulpit about the specifics. He read instead from scripture about forgiveness and the need to hold one another up, but outside, people spoke of it as an act of desecration, a test. Soon after, bad luck seemed to thread through the neighborhood like a trembling fault line. The taco truck's propane line failed, and for a week the truck shut down. The owner said he felt like someone had taken the taste out of the city. A young couple expecting their first child had their car break down at the worst possible moment. A neighbor's dog went missing for 2 days and returned 3 pounds lighter. Small injuries and odd accidents stacked up like a bad season. People started to speak of being watched. Then came the dreams. It began with a few. Mrs. Alvarez dreamt that the church bells had not rung, though she had heard them in waking life. A teenager swore she dreamt of rain that smelled like iron and lilies. Father James had a dream so vivid he woke with his rosary tangled in his fingers. In the dream, an old woman at a hospice table smiled and placed a coin on his palm, and the coin was warm. Dreams are strange currency in communities that keep their histories close. Houston is a tie of many cultures, and Montrose Court collected them like patchwork. Old stories of apparitions and holy strangers passed down from parents to children were whispered under breath. Someone remembered a story about a Spanish mission on the far edge of town where a statue had been found to weep. An old woman in the bakery remembered her grandmother telling of a stranger who healed a broken ox during the drought years. These were folklore in the way folklore always is, part memory, part longing. Margaret did not speak much of her dreams at first. She woke one night with the sensation of another presence in the house, someone kneeling by the bed who smelled like basil and the sea. She found, in the morning, a small white handkerchief folded into a square on the kitchen table, embroidered with simple blue stitches she did not recognize. When she asked Maria, the woman only smiled and said she had found it in a drawer and thought Margaret might like to have it back. The town's history was threaded through with other moments that, in the sober light of the present, seemed like a map pointing to something bigger. St. Cecilia's sat on the corner of land that had once been part of a Spanish land grant 2 centuries ago. An old mission's ruin lay not far away, an overlooked patch of bricks and prayer candles that children sometimes climbed on. Stories told that on one winter in the 1800s, a traveling woman had stopped at the mission and promised rain to farmers who had not seen a cloud in months. They laughed, she left, and 3 days later the sky opened. Some people laughed at those stories now, others tucked them in their pockets like talismans. As the small misfortunes accumulated, more people came to Margaret's door. A woman with arthritis in her hands asked if she could sit in Maria's kitchen for warmth. A man who'd been in a scuffle at the corner bar asked if Maria could pray for him because nothing else had helped. Maria's answers were always patient and brief. She sat and touched hands in that way that suggests someone who knows the map of bodies. She listened like someone tracing a river's bends. Nothing ostentatious happened in those rooms. There were no hallelujahs, no heavenly choirs. There was the quiet, unadvertised work of a person who could hold attention like a candle. Small healings began to be noticed. Mrs. Alvarez's swollen knee, which had troubled her for years, eased after she spent an afternoon knitting with Maria on Margaret's porch. A child with a cough stopped waking at night. Neighbors said he never had to take the cough syrup the next week. These were not fireworks. They were ordinary relief, the kind that changes an afternoon for a person and is easily explained away. But the stories grew when details multiplied. The tamale shop owner swore his burned pies, the ones no one could eat, came out tender the morning after he'd left a pan outside Margaret's door. A woman at the laundromat said that a coin she'd lost in the dryer was found in her child's shoe after she'd left it near Margaret's stoop. Not everyone wanted to believe. A radio host, cynical and loud, called the events a Montrose myth and invited callers to mock the idea of miracles. A woman at the bank, practical and tidy, said people should be careful with too much romance about strangers. She worried about scams. These voices pulled at the edges of the story like a current trying to loosen a river's bank. But there were things that refused to be trifled with. The woman who'd lost her voice, a choir singer at St. Cecilia's who had not sung in months after surgery, found her voice returning, first in small phrases, then in full notes that stunned the tiny congregation during a weekday mass. A man who had not walked unaided in years came up the church aisle with a steady step no one could account for. He said he had simply stood up one morning and found his knee did not ache. The parish bulletin leaked the news, and the news leaked like warmed dishwater into the neighborhood. People came with candles, with rosaries, with skeptic hearts and hopeful hands. Something else happened that broke the rhythm of caution. Someone desecrated a relic, not the church's gold chalice or an ancient manuscript. The church's small wooden crucifix, the one that hung in the sacristy, was found with a smear of something dark across the face of Christ. It felt like a dare, to see whether the town would respond with anger, with prayer, with fear. People began to whisper about punishment. The word test moved through prayer groups like a wind that makes trees creak. When the press began to circle, the neighborhood pulled tighter. A reporter from a local television station stopped by Margaret's house, camera in hand, eyes hungry for a picture. Margaret turned the reporter away. She felt the story thinning, becoming bigger than the people it happened to. Father James, too, tried to steady things. He called for calm and charity, for the community to act like the small town that it sometimes was. "We are a people who cherish our small ordinary mercies," he said from the pulpit one Sunday. "Let us not treat miracle like spectacle." Yet almost everyone who encountered Maria began to feel something that did not fit any tidy category. It was not exactly awe, not exactly fear, it was the sensation of being seen in a way that mattered. People used different words: comfort, alignment, the sudden rightness of a well-turned key. Some nights, children on the block swore that light gathered on Margaret's porch like someone had dimmed the stars just above that roof. Some elders shook their heads and said it reminded them of the old blessings their mothers used to say by the stove when a cold front moved in. Margaret kept quiet about the larger things. She would say only this: that the woman at her door had been humble and fierce in the same breath, that she made lemonade and mended shirts with the same patient hands. Margaret would bring you to the place where the rose that had budded opened into a small, perfect bloom and tell you she had seen Maria fold the petals with her thumb like a benediction. She would show you the handkerchief with the blue stitches and say, "I don't know what's happening, but for the first time in years I wake without feeling the weight on my chest." The story had a soft center that people gathered around, and then dangerous edges that made them look over their shoulders. The desecrations continued in small ways. A shrine by the mission was toppled, candles at a roadside memorial were crushed underfoot, a graffiti tag appeared on a wall near the taco truck, a crude swirl that someone claimed was "just kids." Some shut their windows tighter, others, emboldened, started to come. The tension mounted, and with it came warnings. A woman who ran a shelter in another part of Houston called Margaret and insisted she be careful. "These things gather attention," she said. "People come looking for miracles like they're shopping for bargains, and sometimes they break what they find." A man from a nearby parish warned that faith that turned to spectacle was fragile. Even the taco truck man, who had always kept his opinions to himself, cautioned Margaret to be careful whom she let into her house. But there was also a different kind of pressure, a pull, a magnetic curiosity that wrapped itself around the block like a vine. People left notes on Margaret's stoop, little cards with pencil prayers. A boy from the high school left a crumpled dollar with a scribbled "thank you" and a promise to plant a seed in the community garden. A woman who had been away for years came back from Oklahoma after hearing the rumor and sat for an hour in the kitchen with Maria saying nothing until, finally, she cried and spoke of a child she had lost decades ago and felt, for the first time, like it was all right to let the memory be gentle. One night, as wind teased the chimes on the porch and the moon sat like a bright coin in the sky, Margaret stood in her doorway and watched the shadow of someone walking away down the lane. Maria had left to walk, she said, to be among the people, and Margaret felt both relief and a prick of dread. There was a hush in the neighborhood as if something held its breath. At dawn, the rumor spread: someone had been healed in public, but the details were thin, and the air on Montrose felt tight as an unmade bed. People who had come for reasons practical and petty and holy alike found themselves waiting at the edges of their lives for the next small event that might break them into different stories. The front that had brought the cold had not yet passed. The city smelled like wet pavement and the clean metallic tang of something old returning. Inside her house, Margaret kept the handkerchief folded on the table. She did not believe in spectacle, not really. She believed in the quiet rules she and Tom had set for themselves: plant the rose, repay the neighbor for the sugar, keep the porch light on. But when she sat alone at night, she could not help thinking of the depth of Maria's eyes the night she arrived, and of the way Blue the cat had fit himself like a comma on Maria's lap. She could not help thinking of the way people had come to her kitchen, with their aches and their bright small hopes, and how, in that little room, answers had seemed to come unsought. Something was rising that neither she nor the neighborhood could stop. The smallest sparks had a way of catching in dry grass. The city was waking to the fact that a story was moving through it, a story that would test things people held dear: faith, skepticism, the limits of charity, and the line between private kindness and public miracle. When the sun went down and the streetlights felt like the eyes of the town, Margaret sat at her window and listened for footsteps. The next knock on her door would be heavier than the last, she felt, and whatever it brought would not be contained to her four walls. She thought of Tom and the old rule about never leaving a soul to the night. She thought of the small embroidered handkerchief and the rose that had opened. Outside, someone whispered a prayer, and the night seemed to answer with a slow, steady hush. And then, sometime after midnight, as Blue twitched in his sleep and the lamps in the houses down the block blinked one by one, a sound came from the street that changed the rhythm of the house: single, clear, and utterly human. It was not a knock, it was a cry, somewhere between a wail and a call, the kind that splits the ordinary into before and after. Margaret stood up, hand on the knob, breath making a small cloud in the cold air, and walked out into the hall. She did not know yet whether the thing she would open the door to would be a miracle, a trouble, or both. She opened the door to a sound that made blood slow, a human sob that was not for theater but for real pain. A man crouched on the sidewalk, hands over his face, shoulders shaking. He was young, maybe in his 30s, jacket torn at the elbow, breath steaming in the cold. Around him, the street was quieter than usual, like a room waiting for an answer. Margaret had the light on, the threshold warm. Blue patted at her heels and then sat, watching the man as if he were another guest. Maria, who had been standing inside the kitchen, had already come to the step. The stranger did not ask for shelter, he asked for help. "My son," he said, voice raw, "my son, they said it was the end, they told me to bring him to a shelter or the hospital. I don't know what to do." He had a photograph in his palm, crumpled at the corner. The picture showed a boy no older than 7, smiling crookedly, his leg in a faded cast. The man's skin was wet with tears now. Margaret's hands were suddenly steady. The way hands become steady when they have to be. She made room at her small dining table. She offered coffee that she did not drink and a plate of crackers. Maria sat, took the photograph as if it were a small coin, and turned it gently. "Where is he?" Maria asked. "At the shelter 2 streets over," the man said. "They said he's a lost cause, he's been sick for months, the doctor said." He stopped and could not finish the sentence. Margaret called the number of the shelter, spoke quietly, and then put the phone down. It was late, the shelter would close soon. The man's eyes were fixed on Maria as if she held an explanation he couldn't make himself ask for. She looked back at him with a kind of calm that felt older than prayer books. "Take me to him," she said. They walked through the fat light of the street lamps and down a lane that smelled like wet concrete and fried onions. A few neighbors were out, drawn to the sight like moths, because by now people noticed. Word ran on this block like a rumor that will not be silenced: the woman in Margaret's house moves in ways that unsettle the ordinary. At the shelter, the night receptionist was tired and impatient. The man's plea did not move her at first. They had rules, there had to be beds for families, an intake form, a file to fill. The shelter was full of people with stories that had edges. The receptionist handed the papers like a shield, but when Maria stepped inside, all the edges softened. She moved past the bureaucratic practices with a presence that seemed to rearrange the air. She did not wave or demand, she simply walked to the cot where the boy lay and bent over him. He was small and pale, the cast on his leg patched in places. He was breathing shallow, more like a tired machine than a child. The boy's mother sat beside him, fingernails chewing at the hem of her sleeve. She had been at the end of her tether. Maria put one hand on the boy's forehead, her fingers were cool. No one in the shelter had expected anything to happen. The rules of health and medicine had not been suspended. But then the boy's breath changed. It deepened with a sound like a sigh someone makes when a long-held secret is finally told. His eyes opened, first like a shutter, then wide and bright. He reached up and touched his leg. "I can move it," he said in a small voice that filled the room like a bell. The shelter worker, practical and careful, snapped pictures for documentation. Phones came out from pockets. The boy swung his leg in a small arc and then laughed, loud and delighted. The mother wept until she could not breathe. The man who had brought the photo dropped to his knees and laughed and cried at once, the sound tearing at the night. News moves quickly in little places and in big ones too. Someone posted a shaky video online. The clip was short, the hand on the boy's forehead, a bright inhalation, a child's laugh, the video crossed the neighborhood like fire on dry grass. People who had been waiting in the margins, skeptics, believers, the curious, suddenly found reason to come. The shelter's quiet night became a crowd. By morning, St. Cecilia's had more people than seats. The church steeple, which had always been modest and a touch worn from decades of Houston humidity, became a focal point. People stood in the aisles and outside the doors. Some leaned against the warm brick and pressed their hands to the stone as if feeling for the heat of what had happened inside. Father James spoke from the pulpit with a voice that tried to be ordinary and failed because the congregation was not ordinary anymore. He read the gospel and then paused. "I do not know what to call this," he said plainly. "I believe in prayer, I believe in the work God asks of us, but tonight we have seen something that humbles us." Reporters came in vans, their cameras bright and hungry. The local TV had a banner that read "Local Miracle." And the internet churned with hashtags. Friends who had moved away called to ask if the story was true. People who had never spoken to Margaret came to her door with candles, with rosaries, with vials of holy water from other parishes. Margaret felt the attention like a hand on her shoulder. Steady and heavy, she wanted to retreat, to shut the door and let the porch light keep watch, but she also felt a fierce protectiveness for the people who came, because it had begun there, in her house, with a woman who smelled of rain. The more the neighborhood watched, the more it felt like a stage. There were those who came to watch the extraordinary and leave unimpressed, those who came to be healed and those who came to test. A nurse from Methodist Hospital stood in the back row during a warm Tuesday service and raised her voice to ask Father James whether people were being hurt by false hope. A retired teacher, hands folded and complexion thin, spoke of the goodness she had seen and of the way small kindnesses become public property. Then something happened that broke the pattern in a way that could not be easily dismissed. A public miracle, the kind that leaves no good hiding place for disbelief, unfolded in front of hundreds. It was an ordinary Thursday. The sun had been a harsh light all day, the kind that makes people seek shade. A dozen people had come to St. Cecilia's for the afternoon prayer meeting. More stood outside on the steps. The shelter boy's mother had come with her son, now walking without a limp, holding his hand and smiling like a bulb that had just been lit. People clutched tissues and crossed themselves. Cameras from phones were up. The pastor asked for calm and prayer, and the crowd complied. Because they wanted something real to hold on to. A woman from the neighborhood, Carmen, who had arthritis that had kept her from kneeling for years, stood in the back. She had come because she had nothing left to lose and because her mother had told her stories of saints and strangers who changed things by their mere presence. Carmen could not kneel on her own, she could not sit on hard benches without pain, her hands shook with effort. Maria moved through the crowd like a slow tide, her shawl falling behind her like an afterthought. She did not promise anything, she touched hands the way one might touch a damaged painting, with danger and reverence. When she reached Carmen, she did not look at the arthritis chart or at the bent tendons that had kept the woman in pain for years. She touched Carmen's hands and said, simply, "Breathe." Carmen breathed. It was not a miracle that arrived like lightning, it was a small, intimate reordering. Her knees, which had been treacherous for years, steadied. She could rise without the old crackle of pain. She knelt for the first time in a decade and wept, not from sudden ecstasy but from a long season of missed habits returning to life. But the real moment came when a man named Elias stood up from the back row. He was a quiet man who ran the corner grocery and had been a neighbor for 30 years. No one expected him to be part of a miracle. Elias had been born with something the doctors called a congenital heart problem, a narrow valve that made his chest ache when he walked long distances. He was 45 and had resigned himself to a life of short walks and gentle, careful breath. People who loved him adjusted their expectations accordingly. On that Thursday, Elias walked down the aisle at the back, steady, like someone making a small, sick pilgrimage. He had been pressing his hand to his chest, as he often did during storms or when the groceries were heavy. When he reached Maria, he set his hand out and said, more to himself than to her, "If you can, please." Maria placed her palm over his heart. The room that had been full of ambient noise leaned in like a living thing. Something moved under her hand. Elias's face, lined with lines made from years of caution, softened. He took a breath like it was the first real thing he had tasted. He stepped backward and then forward and then away, walking up the center aisle past pews full of people who were now silent, some with tears and some with jaw tight. Father James, who had been watching with a priest's natural reserve, folded his hands and said a short prayer that seemed to be for everyone. That night, Elias walked home without stopping for rest. He carried his groceries home without help. The next day, he returned to the store and moved stock from the truck to the cooler with the steady pride of someone who had been returned a small part of life. The neighborhood's phone cameras made a collage of the events. Videos appeared that were tender and grainy, edited and viral. The web was fickle but hungry, and for a few days the Montrose story was the top thing on local feeds. People came in droves to St. Cecilia's, priests from other parishes visited, a theologian from a nearby university called with questions and a request for interviews. A group of students held a vigil and read aloud the history of apparitions, the Virgin of Fatima. Our Lady of Guadalupe, names that made some people nod and others bristle. With attention came tests. A group of teenagers dared each other to try to disprove the miracles. A skeptical pastor from an outside church issued a statement about the dangers of charismatic impressions and the need for careful theological inquiry. An online forum dedicated to debunking miraculous claims posted a thread that turned the neighborhood into a strange amphitheater. People who came for the healing found themselves also under microscopes. Not everyone who touched Maria felt change. Some left as they had entered, bones heavy and doubts intact. That was important. If miracles felt universal, they would be easily dismissed as mass hysteria. If they felt arbitrary, they would become frightening. That they happened in ways small and particular, a knee that straightened, a breath that deepened, a cast that came off, made the story more complicated to explain and harder to dismiss. Between the public events, the vandalism continued. Someone slashed the banner outside the mission ruins, tearing fabric that had been hanging as a memorial. A crucifix at a private garden was found broken at the base. People whispered about opposition, enemies, and active contempt. Others saw the damage as a taunt, as if a force wanted to make people fear what was happening. The town's council called for calm. The local police increased patrols. A community meeting in the small gym of St. Cecilia's turned heated. People who wanted to protect Maria's privacy clashed with those who wanted to publicize the events to get help to more people. Amid the tumult, there were those who insisted on history. An elderly woman named Rosa, who used to teach local history at the community center, pulled together a stack of old newspapers and parish records. She spread them on the church hall table and said, softly, "This is not the first time something like this has been here." She pointed to a yellowed clipping from 1912 describing a winter of strange weather and an elderly woman who had given water to a traveler and then vanished. A diary from the 1950s mentioned a woman who had walked through the mission ruins and left behind a small oil lamp. These were the kind of threads that stitch folklore to present day. People wanted a pattern, a map that would tell them what to expect. The pattern, for those who believed, was the circle of visitation, the stranger who arrives with nothing, the small miracles that repair life, the swell of attention, then the tests that either break the faith or deepen it. People compared notes. A neighbor, Miguel, said his grandmother used to say that when the blessed visit, you first see small things change, a well that begins to fill, a child's cough that clears. And then the world asks a question back. The question, Miguel said, is whether you will guard what was given or turn it into a show. It was in that tense mix that the mayor's office called a press conference. They planned to make statements about crowd control and public safety. The mayor, a measured man who had learned to speak for many people at once, nodded when he spoke of respect for faith and for safety. He urged people to be calm. In the crowd outside, journalists jostled for position and people held homemade signs: believe, pray, protect. On the same day the mayor spoke, a group of outsiders appeared with camera rigs of a kind the neighborhood had not seen. They were from a national network, and their presence made the local reporters both wary and eager. Some locals were thrilled, a chance for their story to be heard wider. Others were suspicious, fearing they would turn grief into entertainment. Father James asked for prayer that the event would be handled with care. He prayed not for glory but for truth. In the middle of all that noise, Maria continued to move quietly. She did not seek the microphones, she did not call for processions or build petition lists. She made tea for people who had not eaten, mended shirts, offered to sit with the dying when asked. She walked through the parish hall without fanfare. People followed, sometimes in a hopeful hush. Then, one night when the moon hid behind a slow bank of cloud, someone left a message at Margaret's door. It was written in careful block letters: "Stop her or we will." No signature, no reason. The note was a blade slipped under a mat. Margaret held it and felt something hot and raw like fear. She could not imagine who would want to stop a woman who mended hearts and fixed faucets. But fear is always a good engine for people to forget courtesies. Warnings multiplied. The shelter director insisted Maria not visit late at night, citing liability. A councilwoman called for an investigation into the events, worried about the potential for mass hysteria. Father James received a whispered threat when he locked the parish office one evening, a voice at the window saying harsh things about false prophets. The neighborhood that had seemed like a quiet refuge felt, all at once, like a field of fragile glass. As the days passed and miracles continued in small and quiet ways, the story changed shape again. For some, the occurrences were a source of hope and repair. For others, they were a danger moving toward division, and for a small number of people, there was a growing certainty that the woman at Margaret's house was not merely a kind stranger. Her face began to be called by a name that startled even the most faithful. Not Maria as a simple name, but Mary, the name of the mother of Jesus. Whispered like a consecrated thing. That name traveled slowly, like a rumor that used a better voice. It slipped into conversations at the laundromat and the grocery and then into late-night phone calls. Some who said it did so with obvious discomfort, as if the sound itself might summon things larger than they could carry. Others said it with comfort, like a key in a lock. Margaret did not like the name, it felt like a label that would squeeze the living thing into a stone. She feared both the spectacle and the danger it might bring, but still, people used the name, and their use of it changed how they walked in the neighborhood. Children began leaving little bouquets on the mission ruins, an old man left his rosary beside Margaret's stoop, a teenager filmed a slow, reverent shot of the rose bush opening, and the clip found its way onto channels where millions watched. The story was no longer local, it had become a question the city could not ignore. What do you do when a place you have always known as ordinary starts to feel like the edge of something holy and dangerous at once? That question settled on the block like fog. It made people wary and brave, it moved the police to post more patrols and the internet to post more videos, it made some people kneel in the church and others grind their teeth in skepticism, it made the mayor call for rules and the shelter director for restraint, it made the people who had been helped feel grateful and vulnerable. And in the middle of it all, Maria moved as she always had, close to the small tasks, the humble touch, the soft work of staying. People who watched her felt the pulse of something not easily labeled, a history that might be older than the city, a presence that did not demand praise but simply asked to be known. The night the boy with the cast ran past Margaret's porch and rang the bell to show off his healed leg, the air felt electric, the news vans had left, the crowds had thinned, the quiet had returned, but changed. A pair of strangers stood at the curb, watching, one held a camera and the other held a small silver object that caught the moon. They were not from the neighborhood, they had arrived with questions. They had the kind of eyes that cataloged things for later telling. Margaret watched from the doorway, hand on the frame. She had seen many people in the weeks since Maria arrived, the healed and the doubters, the helpful and the threatening. She did not know what would happen next, she only knew that the world had shifted beneath her feet and that the small house she lived in had become an unsteady harbor for a story too big for anyone alone. She closed the door gently when the boy ran in laughter, just as a truck hummed down the street and a far-off siren began to wail. Inside, the house felt like a chest holding a heart. Margaret folded the handkerchief and placed it in the same drawer where Tom kept his letters. She stood for a moment with her hand on the wood and felt the house shiver, as if it had learned something and was not sure whether to be afraid or grateful. Outside, the stars hid their faces under cloud, someone whispered a prayer on the sidewalk, and somewhere beyond the ring of streetlights, something watched. The neighborhood was no longer merely a map of addresses, it had become a place where people waited with breath held, waiting for what would happen when the next voice rose and the next hand reached out to touch the thing that had come. The road ahead felt steep and bright and frightening, the story had bent into public view, and the world had begun to ask its questions, but the deepest question, who was the woman who walked through the neighborhood like weather, had not yet been answered. The name on people's lips had changed from Maria to Mary, and the sound of that name made some people weep and others scold themselves for believing. In the dark, Margaret laid her head against the hallway wall and listened to the house breathe. She thought of Tom and how he would have wanted her to offer shelter, she thought of the boy now inside playing, of the man who had knelt at the threshold laughing and crying, she thought of the note under her mat that had threatened them, of the vandalized shrine, of the women at the shelter who had slept easier that night. She could not have known then, no one could, that what was coming would make even the faithful question their steadiness. The events would soon draw a crowd so large that the city would have to decide how to manage it. They would force priests to speak with authority and scientists to raise questions. They would set father against son, skeptic against believer, neighbor against neighbor. They would call into focus something people sometimes hide in polite life, what they would surrender in exchange for a miracle, what they would protect at the cost of losing community. And yet, for all those pressures and for all the noise, one thing remained simple and private. In a house on the corner of Montrose and 3rd, a woman with gray in her hair kept the porch light on and the kettle warm. She kept a place at her table. She kept, folded on the table, a small handkerchief embroidered in blue. She kept the memory of the night a stranger knocked and asked for warmth. When the clock leaned toward midnight and the house grew thin with its own quiet, a figure stood at the window across the street. Nobody had called her, she simply appeared, watching the little bungalow like someone taking note. Her silhouette was small against the glass, and for a moment Margaret thought she saw a crown in the moonlight, no more than a trick of shadow. Then the figure moved away, like one who had other places to be. Margaret closed the curtains and put the kettle on to boil. Her hands did not tremble as they had in the first days, she felt steadier now, as if the neighborhood's strange weather had begun to teach her how to breathe in a new way. She did not know what the next day would bring, the reporters, the skeptics, the rejoicing, the danger. But she knew one thing as clear as the light on her porch: someone had come, someone had opened a door and the world had changed. And just as she reached for the mug, her phone buzzed on the table, a text from an unknown number. "They are coming." The message had no signature. The street outside answered with a single distant sound, the slow inhale of a city about to wake. The text on Margaret's phone felt like the first crack in a dam. "They are coming." She folded the note and slipped it into the drawer with Tom's letters, then stood in the dim kitchen a long time, listening to the house breathe. Outside, the block that had felt small and private for so long stretched itself into something else, tents, folding chairs, candlelight, and the low electric hum of a city that had suddenly remembered how to watch. By morning, Montrose Court was a river of people. Folks who had never walked past St. Cecilia's came with bags and cameras, with lined faces and new hope. Pilgrims came with rosaries and schoolchildren with skip ropes, veterans in ball caps, and women with hands that had known hard labor. Reporters set up risers and microphones, and live streams bloomed across screens. People who had been polite and quiet in their little lives now found themselves speaking into camera lights about being ready to receive what came. The mayor stalled, then met with Father James in a packed office where the wood smelled of old prayer books. They discussed crowd control, traffic, liability, and the long list of things that must be said. The police came in with plans and radios, and the health department offered a tent and volunteers. It was as if the city moved around the phenomenon the way water moves around a rock. Practical plans could not quite touch the thing itself. The hush behind the throng. Maria kept to the edges, as she had always done. She moved quietly through the crowd like a person who was part of the weather, not the capital. People pressed letters and folded slips of paper into her hands. A mother handed her a small blanket with the name of her child embroidered. A woman in a business suit, too tired to cry, asked Maria to pray for her mother in hospice. Maria nodded and accepted the items with a softness that felt like a benediction. And then, because human gatherings are like storms, something broke. A group of people who called themselves skeptics had come prepared. They had cameras and questions and an energy that felt like a gale. They demanded evidence. They wanted to test the woman who had healed knees and steadied breaths. They performed their own little rituals of doubt, measuring temperatures, pacing distances, whispering theories. Some of their questions were careful and reasonable. Others carried into them the glare of wanting to disprove a fragile hope. On the third day, the tension in the square snapped. Someone, not from the neighborhood but carrying a small, crumpled sign, pushed through the crowd. They reached the steps of St. Cecilia's and, in a movement that felt sudden and ugly, they tipped a can of black paint against the base of the mission statue where people had been leaving flowers. The paint spilled like a bruise and painted a dark smear across the saint's feet. The crowd gasped. For a moment no one moved. People who had come for the quiet miracle felt something sour and metallic in their mouths. Then anger rose like heat. Voices shouted. The police moved in. Hands reached for the tip of that ugly moment. The man with the paint was stunned by what his act had done, but what he had not expected, and what no one could have predicted, was how swiftly the world responded. It began as wind. There was no warning thunder, only a sudden lifting of air that sent streamers of prayer cards and tissue into a swirl. The paint on the statue did not dry. It seemed to pulse, shifting like oil on water. People later swore they saw into it. Flowers embedded, small hands pressed to the stone like the memory of touch. Others said the paint ran back as if pulled by the statue itself. And when the police reached the man, his hands were empty, his face wet with tears. He had not planned to cry. He could not explain why his arm shook, why the urge to anger had leapt inside him, nor why his voice broke into apologies that were nearly prayers. The priest helped the man to his feet and brought him to the side where people offered him a blanket. No one called for his arrest. The shape of the crowd had changed into something else, compassion that almost looked like reverence. People began to tell the story in a dozen different ways. Some said the statue had asked for mercy. Others said the stranger who had come to Margaret's door had drawn that mercy from the air with nothing but a look. A few voices spoke of punishment, but the sound of punishment had been replaced by confessions and embraces. The skeptics, caught off guard, retreated to their cameras and their screens, their questions turning smaller as the crowd's compassion filled the space. After the paint incident, the nature of what was happening shifted again. It was no longer only about small private healings. People came because the place, the mission ruins, the church, Margaret's porch, felt like a scene between ordinary life and something else. The city brought ambulances and brackets of practical care. Priests warned about testifying to miracles, and doctors advised caution. But the thing itself was stubbornly beyond the reach of agendas. Around 3 weeks into the strange season, a day arrived that would become the hinge of the story, the day that would be played again and again in shaky videos and steady documentaries. It started like many others, prayer groups, candles, people folding their hands, but the number of those gathered had grown to the point where the church could not hold them. People spilled out into the yard, into the street, and into a line that curved like a river down Montrose Court. At one end of that line was a young woman named Lila, who had been suffering with a tumor in her abdomen for months. Doctors had told her family that the tumor was advanced and that further surgery would be risky. Lila had come because a friend handed her a note and said, simply, go. She had come dressed in a pale blouse and a scarf that had been knitted by her grandmother. She came with the weary grace of someone who had been told to prepare for a long goodbye. People pressed forward so that Lila could reach the front. When she did, she knelt and placed both hands in the hands of Maria. The woman's palms were cool. Her shawl smelled like basil and rain. Maria did not shout commands. She did not make firm promises. She closed her eyes as if hearing a chord that no one else could hear. Lila inhaled. She had already been practicing long breaths to manage pain, but something in that moment changed the arc of her chest. It was as if a hand had come across her sternum and eased it open. She lay back on a blanket the volunteers had spread, her family gathered close, the crowd watched, holding their breath. A hush fell in a place that had never known such silence. Then it happened. Lila sat up, steady, and asked for water. Her sister handed her a bottle and she drank with a hunger that had nothing to do with thirst. People wept quietly. An elderly man in the front row crossed himself with a noise like a soft clap. The local TV captured moments that would later cut across feeds, Lila laughing and dropping her scarf, an old woman clapping her hands in delight, a child holding a candle steady. A team of doctors who had been watching from the distance moved closer later that day. They examined Lila with the careful skepticism of their profession. Scans taken at the hospital the next morning showed changes that left them at a loss for good words. Lila's tumor, which had seemed incurable, showed signs of regression the doctors could not explain. They used phrases like unexpected decrease and idiopathic remission. Words that are meant for pathology tried to make room for a thing that didn't fit inside their charts. The city buzzed with a new energy. People who had once been careful in their beliefs found themselves offering prayers they had said in childhood. Strangers sat on porches and told stories of miracles they remembered in their family history. The whole neighborhood felt like a wound that had been kissed with a salve. And still, the truth took its time to arrive. For every story of healed knees and moving legs, there were questions and contradictions. Some healings were later explained by treatment and rest. Some remained stubbornly inexplicable. The media tried to contain it with headlines and tags, the city tried to manage it with permits and barricades, and the faithful tried simply to hold it like a fragile glass. Then, one evening, an event occurred so private and so public at once that it bent the story into its irreversible shape. Father James had come to Margaret's house to ask Maria to speak at a vigil. He wanted words that could hold people's hearts without pushing them into illusion. He had been in the house before. He trusted Margaret and had come often to sit at her kitchen table. That night, the kitchen was filled with the sound of rain on the roof, like a steady prayer. Maria agreed to the vigil but would not speak from the pulpit. She asked instead to sit under the church's old tree at dusk. People assembled as dusk folded into night. Candles lit the yard with small bright mouths. The television cameras were there, but because the yard was lit mostly by candlelight, they did not dominate the picture. People sang quietly, some haltingly, in a dozen languages stitched together by the neighborhood. The children of Montrose, who had been here long before the world came, ran between candles with the reckless care of those who do not yet understand the gravity of the space. Midway through the vigil, something shifted. The candles seemed to gather their flames to a single steady glow, and the air tasted like tea and soil. Maria rose to her feet and walked to the center where a small stone altar had been placed. She stood there and lifted her shawl. The shawl, which had been plain and frayed at the edges, shimmered with a light that was not too bright to look at but bright enough that people felt its warmth. The aura had the softness of washed linen and the faint glint of old gold. She did not speak, she simply stood, and then the most ordinary thing unfolded into the most extraordinary. A voice rose from the crowd, small and rough, and began to tell of a life that the speaker had lost. A mother, a child, a secret hurt. Tears began like rain on dry ground. One person, then a dozen, then everyone. The storytelling turned into a chorus of confession and yearning, and the place felt like a huge heart where every ache returned like a folded letter. When the last voice finished, the hush that followed was an animal sound. Maria stepped forward and took the hand of an old woman who had been in the back, a woman whose husband had left in the 70s and never come back. Maria touched her forehead with fingertips that felt like wet stone. The old woman's eyes, which for years had been clouded, cleared like windows after a storm. She laughed like someone who had just remembered a secret and then wept. It was a quiet, intimate miracle, one among many, but because it happened in the small heart of the vigil it felt like the center of things. A reporter, who had been standing in the shadow, whispered into his mic, "Is she?" and the word hung like a question that needed to be answered. After the vigil, people lingered under the tree, wrapped in blankets and mumbled prayers. The crowd spilled back into the street, and as the night thinned some stayed to clean candles and pick up wrappers, others walked away with their lives changed in small private ways. The city had once again made itself a part of the scene, permit applications, health checks, interviews. But something had shifted beyond the ability of any bureaucrat to catalog. People began to speak the name with a new confidence, Mary. Not everyone said it the same way. Some said it as if repeating a memory, others as if testing the sound on their tongues to see if it fit. For many, the name invoked the great stories of the world, Our Lady of Guadalupe, Our Lady of Fatima, and carried with it a deep global weight. For others, it was a simple name, the one the woman had given when she first came to Margaret's door. Over time, in kitchen talk and interviews and whispered prayer, the idea gathered like a tide. The truth, when it came, did not arrive in one thunderclap, it arrived in fragments that accumulated like footprints. A woman who had been near the shelter swore that when Maria had knelt there that night, the boy had seen not the face of a stranger but the gentle outline of a halo in the lamplight. A priest from a neighboring parish wrote a careful note describing a scent, faint, like lilies in ocean, that seemed to cling to Maria and then vanish. A photographer, who had shot 1,000 weddings and funerals, developed a roll of film and found, not a trick of light, but a stable image. In the grainy frame, when the light hit Maria's shawl, there appeared a faint pattern resembling a crown. People brought relics and rosaries and photographs to Margaret's kitchen. They left them at the table and traced them with fingers that trembled. One night, a woman who had lost faith in prayer placed a cheap wooden crucifix on the table and said, "If this is a joke, take it away." She found, when she left later that night, that the crucifix had been smoothed, its grain worn like a work of long, careful hands. She could not have explained how it had happened, she only knew that she felt something loosen inside her chest. Slowly, painfully, the truth emerged in the way truth sometimes does, as witness after witness, as small miracles and large questions. The local diocese formed a committee, scientists and doctors came to study metabolic changes in the healed, skeptics wrote scathing articles, priests and saint specialists compared the events to other visitations and cautioned, always, against hasty conclusions. Interviews were broadcast where people tried to fit the thing into their vocabularies and failed. As often as they succeeded. Through it all, Maria moved like an answer no one could prematurely name. Her hands continued to mend shirts and straighten quilts. She refused to be the center of any staged spectacle. She would take an old man's hand and say a brief prayer and disappear. She fed people and put bandages on scraped knees. She sat with families who had been told impossible things and who needed someone to make space for their fear. And then, the small, private moment that collapsed into undeniable evidence. It happened at St. Cecilia's on a summer morning when the church was flooded with light. The same boy who had been at the shelter, now older and running, brought his father to the front. The father had been a man of few words who drank to forget. He had come, finally, to offer his thanks and to say that he had seen his son run. The congregation wept with them. As the father spoke, Maria stood behind him with her hand on his shoulder. He turned and reached for the hand that touched him. When he looked up, his face went slack with a clarity that made the world seem to tilt. He said, in a voice like someone who had found something under a stone, "You are Mary." The room did not know what to do with that sentence. Some laughed nervously, some crossed themselves hard enough to make their chests ache. No one had expected confession to arrive as a label. Maria, who had always refused the center, did not move to correct him. Instead she lowered her eyes, like someone who knew the weight of a name and did not wish to bear it alone. From that day forward, the narrative thread tightened, stories accumulated, a woman whose cataracts faded, a boy whose seizures stopped, a man who, after decades, found a letter from his brother who had disappeared overseas, and each story created a net that made the idea of a stranger no longer quite fit. The name Mary, when spoken, started to feel less like a claim and more like a recognition. People who had come as skeptics found themselves taking off their hats to touch the ground. Those who believed found their belief steadier, deepened by what they had seen. What the city did next was predictable and yet inadequate. Officials asked the diocese to investigate. The diocese sent a commission. Newspapers printed both praise and scorn. People argued about the right course of action, canonize or caution, celebrate or study. But the thing that mattered to the people of Montrose was not the verdict from afar. It was whether their neighbors could be fed, whether children would sleep, whether the old could be tended with the dignity they had once known. Time, that slow and merciless judge, did its work. Some miracles held. Some faded into the realm of unexplained recoveries, some changed in their contours as lives moved on. The crowd that had once filled the church thinned in the months that followed as the city found its rhythm. Reporters moved on to the next headline, but something smaller and truer remained. The block had changed. People who had once passed each other with careful civility now lingered. There were new kitchens that fed the hungry and a small clinic that offered care. Margaret, who had been the first to open her door, found her house quieter again. The handkerchief with the blue stitches sat in Tom's drawer, a quiet relic. What lingered most was not the spectacle but the way people remembered how to be with one another. A woman who had been bitter and alone found friends who brought pans of food. The man who had painted the statue came back to the mission and helped scrub the stone clean. People who had used their questions like weapons began to listen to people who had been helped and to tell of their small private awe. The city had, in that strange season, come closer to something like a shared care. And yet, even as ordinary mercy took root, something holy and haunting remained. The question of identity, who had come to that door and why, never entirely settled. Some in the community grew steadfast in the belief that it was the Virgin Mary. Others were content to say they had been touched by something that could not be named. Maria herself never claimed a title. She continued to say, "I am Maria," when asked. But when no one was looking she sometimes lifted her shawl in the small room at Margaret's end, with a quiet smile, straightened it as if doing a simple, old work. Margaret kept the porch light on for a long time after. She planted another rose bush and learned, with the help of neighbors, how to keep it alive. She found herself standing at the window in the early morning, watching for the figure who had first come on a cold night. Once, in the soft gray of dawn, she thought she saw a crown of stars in a shadow moving down the street. She could not be sure if it had been a trick of light or a gift of the morning. Either way, the feeling stayed, that life was a long conversation between the ordinary and the sacred, and sometimes the sacred came as a woman asking for shelter. The last thing that happened in the story, the thing that settled like a final page in a book not quite finished, was quiet. Years later, people still told the story. A small plaque was placed in the yard of St. Cecilia's to commemorate the season. People debated its wording and finally agreed on, for those who found care here. The plaque did not name miracles, it named care. That was enough for many. It was honest and human. On a late spring afternoon, when the city felt like it was finally healed of the sharpness of those first weeks, a woman walked up Montrose Court and knocked on Margaret's door. She was not Maria, and no one expected her to be. She was a teenager, hair pinned back, a little nervous, carrying a dish of warm bread. She had come because the story had reached her school and because she wanted to say thank you to the neighborhood that had become a lesson in gentleness. Margaret opened the door and saw that the girl's eyes were the same color as her own, the same mixture of fear and hope. They exchanged the small ritual of neighbors, a nod, a question about the weather, an offering of bread. The world had not become a perfect place. There were still losses and grief, there were still people who would not be healed, but there was also a changed city with new habits of care. As for Maria, people said she left Montrose quietly one night, just as she had arrived. Some said she walked across the river and vanished into the early fog. Others swore they saw her beside the mission ruins, smiling and tending small offerings. A few insisted she had always been there in different forms, that every town keeps its angels in plain clothes. The debate never mattered quite as much as the small fact that someone had been welcomed when she knocked, and that welcome had made a neighborhood larger. The story ended, as stories must, in a kind of grace. People returned to their lives carrying the memory of the things they had witnessed and the question that had followed them home: what are we made to do with the things we cannot explain? For many, the answer lay in the quiet work of care. For a few, it lay in prayer and liturgy. For others, it was the simple moral of Margaret's choice: open the door. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched you even a little, please like this video and subscribe so you won't miss future stories like this. Share it with someone who could use a moment of wonder. And if you're moved, hit the bell so you'll be the first to hear what happens next. Thank you for being here. Your support keeps these true feeling tales alive.